Hello again. Welcome to the second session of HPPA Symposium. I'm very glad to be here and see all of you here today. We had a great session last night. I believe you were all over there, but if you missed the session, we recorded the keynote lecture and the discussion after that through a YouTube channel, and the link will be posted on HPPA website in a week or so. So today we're gonna continue the program. Before talking about the lecturers today, I wanna repeat the few housekeeping notes that I mentioned last night. So please turn off your microphones. Please be muted during the lectures. And please note that we're recording the sessions similar to last night, and we're gonna share it with you later. And if you don't wanna be seen in the videos, please turn off your camera. You can change the way in which you want to see the presentation with the presenter's face or the audience by clicking on the view, which is on top right corner. And for asking questions and participating in the discussion after the lecture, please either wave or raise your hand, or use Zoom to raise your hand, or write something in the chat so we ask you to unmute to talk. One more time, I would like to thank all the alumni who supported HPPA. I also want to encourage everyone who are not a member to be a member of HPPA. I would like to thank the current HPPA board members that supported the idea of having a virtual symposium. Michael Tomlin as the advisor of the HPPA for his great guidance, and the special committee and its chair, Michelle Van Meter. Michelle introduced the members of the committee last night, the members including myself, Melanie, and Zoe, and Shannon, who's I believe is not here, Shannon. For today's session, we have three speakers. We have three presentations, I should say. First one is by Kamalika Bose, HPP 13. Then we have a roundtable and discussion led by Swapna Kotari, HPP 14. And at the end, we have a presentation by Mariam Rabi, HPP 2018. To start, we're going to ask Kamalika to present her presentation titled Global Issues, Local Actions, Working with Communities in India. Kamalika is an urban conservationist and founder of Heritage Synergy India, a Mumbai-based consultancy. Her work lies at the intersection of built and cultural heritage, curation, research, and education. She has worked on community-oriented urban conservation initiatives and believes in advocacy and awareness building in creating a bottom-up heritage movement in India. She has curated several exhibitions and authored 5 books on her work, and also received several fellowships and awards, including the SIH Getty International Fellowship in 2016. Graduated in 2013 from HPPA Cornell, Kamalika was a Fulbright scholar and assistant professor at CEPT University, Ahmedabad, from 2008 to 2015. Kamalika, thank you very much for joining us today. It's all yours, so you can share your screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayar, and also thank you, Michael, for inviting me to share my work and my thoughts and my learnings. It's been about 8 years since I've come back to India after completing the program. So, but it's only really the first time I'm getting an opportunity to share my work here in the last 8 years with the broader alumni fraternity. So it's really wonderful to do that today. I will start sharing my screen now. Is that visible? Okay. So I'm largely looking at today, my talk will look at local actions. So things that I've been doing here on ground, but how they kind of resonate into larger global issues, things that we all as preservationists probably across the world are trying to talk about and tackle and deal with in many ways. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of a preamble before I move on to 4 projects that I'm going to be speaking about. And I'm going to talk about this great divide that we have in historic preservation. One, which is this divide between the monumental landmarks that are well-loved, protected, celebrated, well-funded, and time and again, those are the ones that we kind of cherry pick and celebrate, while there is this vast percentage of unloved, unprotected, everyday heritage that is lived in, that is transforming, that is transmutating in different ways, which are our inner city neighborhoods, our historic cores, which have seen the vagaries of time and politics and socioeconomic changes having all kinds of impacts on them. And my work in the last 8 years in India has really focused on what you see at the bottom of your screen, the sort of everyday heritage occupied and lived in by communities in India, and not so much on the monumental, iconic landmarks of our country. So I'm just going to outline the 5 kind of, as I understand, the 5 common fates that built heritage in India often undergoes. And this might resonate across all the projects that I show you in different ways. So one and the first is outright demolition of unprotected, unlisted, privately owned properties. The second is demolition by neglect, and we know this only too well, where we wait for natural or man-made disasters and hazards to kind of bring and to be compelled to kind of then pull a building down despite its architectural features or significance that it may have. The third is really incongruent change, when we can't maybe pull it down for whatever reasons, maybe legal hassles, etc. But we kind of create these kind of incongruent additions, etc., to which with then Mars has different implications on the urban fabric of a neighborhood or a street. The fourth is really a mutation. So how different incongruent building campaigns begin to then make it seem as if the building is developing all kinds of tumors and hands and legs out of it. And this is also like pretty much unchecked in our neighborhoods and our streetscapes in urban India. And often these kind of properties are tenanted, so there's a very little you can do to control that. And when all of that adds up, you begin to see how building by building, when things like this happen, it has an implication on the fabric of the neighborhood, the streetscape itself. And you can see here where an iconic monument, it begins to really the loss of the fabric around it due to these kind of lack of regulations, protections, incentives, etc. So and this happens at a slow kind of a pace, and this kind of begins to eat into our neighborhoods in many ways. So with that kind of as a background, the question really becomes, how do we effectively engage then with local actors to save historic assets while managing change? Because yes, we cannot completely negate change and development, but how do we begin to mitigate them? How do we begin to deal with them so that our historic assets don't look like eyesores and don't pop out in an environment which has completely changed? So in that context, I am, now that we kind of globally live in an extremely networked society, and many things that we learn in theory and in academic environments, how do we then, when we come into the world of practice, begin to address and look at those same issues? So I'm going to be through four projects today, talk about four issues. One related to preservation in the context of ethnic identity and ethnic minorities. The second in the context of heritage tourism and cultural tourism. The third project will look at preservation and its tussles with the development conflicts and real estate conflicts that exist. And the fourth is preservation through the lens of speculative action, and how do we as preservationists sometimes have to construct projects when there's actually no project out there for ourselves because we find something meaningful. So the first project that I'm going to be looking at is through the lens of preservation and ethnic identity is the Chinatown in the city of Calcutta, which is also the city of my birth. And this is a project that I did for about 3 years. And the first project that I did after coming back from Cornell. So I was carrying a lot of these, also these idealistic things that I wanted to do and apply, and then how this project became a learning canvas for me. So the Chinatown in Calcutta is really in the heart of the city. You can see in this map from the 19th century, and it's really used to be the buffer between, in Calcutta as a city of colonial construct. So the European town is what you can see at the south, while the Indian town, the native quarters were in the north, and this intermediate town is where the other foreign migrants, such as the Portuguese, the Greeks, the Jews, the Chinese, all kind of migrated for trade and settled down, because Calcutta was the capital of the British Empire in India and the jewel of the crown. So when I came into the project in 2014, there was already a project planned by by a Singapore-based consortium, which was trying to do a tourism-oriented revitalization project for Calcutta's Chinatown. And if you can see this master plan from 2013 made by the Singapore firm, it had all the typical elements that we see in global touristy Chinatowns, such as fancy the gates and the pavilions and the breakfast and the food streets, and brands and shopping, and really transforming the area into something that we know about in the global context. And these were the kind of views that were then given to me. And that's when I thought that, okay, we can't really transplant global preconceived imagery onto our city in the local context without understanding what the ethos of the place itself and what do its people really need. So this was something that I figured right and very early on in the project is not something that either the city needs or its Chinese population. Because this is really what everyday Chinatown looks like. So we went about, so my role in this project when I came in was actually to just do a cultural resource survey to see the built assets and the architectural documentation of the settlement, because no such documentation had ever been done. But I kind of expanded the brief and said that I just can't, do a measure drawing and a documentation project and then let something like the view that we saw before being built. So we went about really doing an exhaustive research to really understand the history of migration of the Chinese in India, when they came, what are the different sub-communities that make up the Calcutta Chinese population, what are their skill sets. And with this kind of a research and this video that we saw, we really saw the bustling Chinatown.
Chinatown in Calcutta. Chinese laundries, shoe shops, tanneries, restaurants, and many other businesses are crowded into this part of the city. In fact, the majority of Calcutta's Chinese live and work here, and there are some 30,000 of them.
But from that 30,000, if we looked at newspapers in the last 10 years, we used to see headlines like this, that the Chinese were migrating. This is now a kind of blighted area, and there's large-scale urban renewal in these neighborhoods. So my question was, why is that? And why did we not know enough to really inform our responses towards this question? So I started investigating further, and that led me to the 1962 India-China War. And the aftermath of this war was really something akin to what the Japanese Americans faced after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the kind of incarceration that the community faced due to the border war between India and China in 1962 led to Chinese families being picked up from Calcutta and all the other cities in India when they were located and put into internment camps. And when they came back from after 4 years, they had lost a lot of their properties, their trade licenses had been seized, they had lost their jobs and shops and everything. So pretty much they had to start from scratch. And the photograph that you see at the bottom, this triggered a large-scale migration because they could not find their way back, despite being 5th and 6th generation Indian citizens, find their way back in the country. And they en masse migrated, and this is their 50th anniversary of this war in Canada. So in Canada, Singapore, London, Australia, these are the places that the community migrated to. And therefore, what you see in Chinatown today are the perception, the general perception is that the people that kind of got left over, they could not go. The population reduced to almost 10% of its original 30,000. So what could you really do when the neighborhood now today looks like this, where one part of it has seen major urban renewal and large-scale high-rises have come up, but it's the inner streets which still have the scale and the character and the fabric which is still intact, though of course not in a good condition at all. So these were the kind of contrasts. And within the neighborhood, but you still had these these listed Chinese temples, the interiors of which were then beginning to display their cultural identity. And around Chinese New Year, it was when all the diaspora came to Calcutta to celebrate for a whole week. So with that kind of a background, when I started with a workshop, this was a collaborative workshop with students from the college in Ahmedabad, in India, where I used to teach, and students from Denmark, from the Aarhus School of Architecture. We were there for 3 weeks, and we realized that this was the kind of map they were working with. They didn't even have any idea of the boundaries of the historic neighborhood. And with that, then we underwent an extensive documentation trying to delineate the neighborhood boundaries, understand what were the cultural assets that the Chinese Indians still hold. And then we realized that it's only about 10 or 15%. So then does it make sense to kind of create the touristy kind of image that we were seeing? Or does this place need something else, which is more of a cultural and an economic revival, and the spirit of pride being restored first before buildings can be restored? So we then collaborated with each of the leaders or the presidents or each of these social clubs to then work with the neighbors and the citizens of Chinatown and change our responses to look at a kind of Jane Jacobs approach of eyes on the street through small, not very expensive interventions to then do contextual improvements which responded to streetscape character, the scale of the neighborhood and the neighborhood needs. So people who own provision stores or eateries, so that their businesses can first be made robust and not creating things like, fancy gates, etc. So this documentation then, through the funding we had from the school at Denmark, we put into a publication, and we decided to circulate it, a copy for each family, so that they are first able to reinstill the lost pride and the scars that the aftermath of the war had left in their mind and memories, and be able to feel like they are a part of the city and reclaim the city in a way. And this was at the end of our workshop, and you can see that the interaction was such that you can't really make out who's the community member, who's the student, who's the faculty. So they had really welcomed us with open arms, and we thought it was our duty to give back and not just look at it as a professional project where we don't give back to the community. So once we did that, and with the book, etc., we begin to see that in a few months that the community itself became highly began to self-mobilize and self-organize themselves, and they did not remain that closed, invisible community that they had become in the aftermath of the war, though it had been 50 years, and started self-organizing walks. They started holding cultural activities outside their enclave, outside Chinatown, in the lakes and in the open spaces and the public parks of Calcutta, in an attempt to not remain invisible anymore. And that to us was the first step in reinstilling the pride and identity, which then had a ripple effect, and the revived community was imperative for any conservation work to take place. We could not talk about building and architectural conservation. It would be a very hollow and very superficial without being able to first revive the community and reinstill their cooperation and pride. And then we saw that this mobilized and awakened community was now leading efforts by themselves without waiting for the city agencies to fund them, by taking up small-scale building repairs and maintenance programs, so that a kind of drab neighborhood, visually drab neighborhood, was now beginning to once again regain some of its qualities and characters. And slowly the neighbors themselves, these clubs themselves, started investing their money in small adaptive reuse programs, which converted unused or abandoned facilities into economically viable restaurants, shops, provision stores, etc. So in the process, what happened is we kind of turned the project, which was proposed by the Singapore firm, on its head, and what was supposed to be what was phase 3 of the project, which was the residential neighborhoods and the lived-in streets, actually became phase 1, while phase 1, which was all the touristy activities, is yet to happen, because we thought that we need to make the place livable and meaningful for the residents first, and not only do things for tourists. But the second project is actually, it's complete, that I'm going to talk about, is actually the complete opposite. And here we realized that heritage tourism and bringing in tourists could be the only viable way to create this revival. And this project is something that I did immediately after Chinatown, and is situated about 130 miles north of Calcutta. And this is a medieval map of the state of Bengal. So about 200 kilometers north of Calcutta is Murshidabad, which is on the banks of the river Ganges, and you can see this map and as the Ganges comes down. So on the north is Murshidabad. It was the former last Islamic capital of Bengal before Bengal went into the hands of the British. And this was the seminal Battle of Plassey in 1757, which led the East India Company, convert its ambitions from just being a trading mercantile entity into sowing the seeds of empire. So this was, Murshidabad was important because of its link to the Islamic power center in Bengal. And these are archival depictions of what the city used to be. But the community I'm talking about is, again, a small community that migrated all the way from Rajasthan on the other side of the country to act as financiers, bankers, and entrepreneurs for the Muslim rulers, for the royal rulers. So this was an extremely affluent banking and merchant community. But after independence, in the last 30 years or so, they have all migrated en masse to Calcutta. So while their lifestyle over there was, you can see, very royal, the kind of large palaces and mansions that they had, a very lavish lifestyle that they had. Today, when I went to this place for the first time in 2015, it was no more than a pale reflection of itself, an abandoned ghost town, because all its residents had moved to Calcutta, and there were only caretakers, one caretaker in each building who was kind of looking after this place. So what could we really do? And the real questions was that, though now, unlike the Chinese community in Calcutta, this was a community that had the finances, that had the resources, that had the business and the entrepreneurial acumen to conserve their settlement if they wanted to, but they did not see the business sense in doing it, because they looked at this as a white elephant. And why would they invest money in something that they are not sure would yield the return on their investment? So then we decided, again, with the members of this community, to I took a bunch of students again to do the documentation, because of course the funds to do this were low. Again, this was a place which had fallen off the radar, so there was no documentation of the place, of its drawings, of its cultural resources, and that became the first step for us to document this 1 square kilometer settlement, and do kind of this SWOT analysis to see what are the opportunities and challenges to revive this place through tourism. And these are the kind of places that are there, which are kind of partially maintained. There are about 14 religious sites, so it's also a religious pilgrimage place for the Jains. And these are the kind of temples and mansions. There are about 7 grand mansions, as you can see, which are kind of just waiting for efforts in adaptive reuse to be converted into maybe heritage hotels, converted into a pilgrim and a tourist circuit. But there's just either the will is not there or the resources are not being plowed in. So these are some of the riverside properties, because it's just on the banks of the river Ganges. And of course, just outside the settlement, it merges back into the rural landscape of Bengal as we move out. And it has its own rural communities, the water networks, the weavers, the cultivation of silk. So there's also a lot of intangible heritage around this settlement per se. So after having done all of this study and documentation, we came back to Calcutta to now formally meet with the community and kind of tell them that what is this great wealth that they're sitting on, but why are they not doing anything about it? And that's when we decided to do a series of national and international conferences over there at Murshidabad, which brought in different voices to raise awareness, not for someone else, but for the historic homeowners, for the homeowners to be sensitized so that they are willing to put in some funding to revive at least something, and come up with some viable projects, because they did not look at their own heritage and as an asset, but as a liability. So it was to dispel that idea. And so then we came up with a strategy, a tourism-led economic strategy, that through using adaptive reuse, restoration, and community engagement, local actions by the community, by plowing in their own funds, could help trigger some level of leveraging their assets in the settlement and its immediate surrounds, to then have a ripple effect in maybe 5 years, 10 years, which could have greater regional impacts in creating a tourism circuit, and which is community led and which has economic benefits for all. And that kind of in 1 year since we did the documentation to when we went back for the seminar, we saw that one of the families had become quite motivated and quite inspired and was willing to take the risk to convert their property. And you can see that they had already started the work in 1 year itself. And we held a series of seminars for 2 years back to back. at this property once they began restoring it to bring this sensitization. And today, about 1.5 years ago, it has opened as the first and only restored heritage hotel in that region. And what that has done is, again, mobilize the community, because like I emphasized, this is a community that has the resources, but just did not have the direction or the motivation to. Now they're trying to revive the entire, the broader culture, their food culture, their other habits through publications, festivals, media engagement, etc. And what that is doing, it is now having that ripple effect, and other homeowners, other palatial palace owners and property owners are also beginning to try to tie into their this effect. And many of these palaces and mansions, which were completely private and not open to visitors at all, are now being restored and partially being opened up for bread and breakfast and visits, and to act as revenue generations, walking tours, etc. So it has begun to have a ripple effect on the larger sector as well, while these kind of itineraries are being now drawn up that brings a mix of the tangible and the intangible property. And a place that had kind of pretty much fallen off the radar is once again, through both domestic as well as international tourists, being replugged back into the tourism map of the country. And therefore, the local actions through is beginning to have, of course, we still have many more years to go before this completely plays out, but the beginnings have been made, and we are seeing the positive impacts of that in the region as well. The third project that I'm going to talk about is in the city of Mumbai, which is the city I currently live in, and which is the real estate and development conflicts are a huge issue in that city. And unlike the last project, which we said is a place that's fallen off the grid in a quiet, sleepy ghost town, this is really the financial capital of India, and has many pressures therefore in preserving its heritage. And here, the idea is to mitigate these development conflicts through participatory planning processes with the community. So the project that I'm going to talk about deals with the native citizens of Mumbai before the Portuguese came there, before the British came there, the indigenous fisher folk community of the city known as the Kolis, and who occupy many such urban villages along the coastline of Mumbai. And it's been an unbroken, continuous tradition. And this is what their settlement today looks like, which is that of an urban village. There's low-scale houses and other fishing facilities, the yards, the drying yards, the places to worship. So it's a self-contained neighborhood with this one, the Worli Fort, which is a Portuguese era monument. Now, the issue is that this is the skyline of Mumbai today. And like I said, urban fishing villages have been under sustained threat of redevelopment and renewal, as they are located in one of the most desired parts of the city, its coast. Fishing villages are not simply housing. Rather, they are strikingly self-contained as urban units with livelihood opportunities, homes, markets, cultural and social institutions, all integrated within a compact and walkable district. But because of the prime real estate that it holds today, they are under major threat for development and for the citizens itself to want to redevelop these properties into high-rise apartments and better living conditions for themselves. So in this situation, the organization that I was working with at that point in time, our initial goal was to not look at the entire settlement, but just look at this maritime fort structure, which was from the Portuguese and British era, but which was at the coast as a watch facility. And this is what the settlement kind of eating into and growing around the fort has now become. So we realized that it's impossible to delink the fort as a historic artifact from the settlement and the urban fabric and the livelihood that has grown about it, because all the open space that you see here are actually fish drying yards. So they have a utility to it. So the idea was that we cannot separate the site from its context. So if we need to do something here, we need to look at the community and the neighborhood and the settlement as a whole. So we envisaged this project, which looked at various urban metrics and urban indicators and then to work with the community to go beyond just facade conservation or settlement conservation and look at each of these aspects to enhance livability, so that the citizens did not wish to redevelop their properties. They did not wish to call their properties slums and demolish them and redevelop them into high rises, but the neighborhood itself became more livable and more habitable for them. But the roadblocks that we faced very early on when we started having these community consultation meetings was that we were met with great suspicion that, maybe we have come from the government, we've come from the city agencies, we want to take away their property. There were all sorts of suspicion drawn towards us because these are contested locations, these are contested sites. And so then we decided we have to change our method of working. And we cannot be walking in with maps and drawings and try to win their trust and try to win their cooperation. So we had to change our method of working and question that, does bottom-up planning also require a bottom-up approach to mapping? And how do architects and planners who have a very formalized way and method of working, how do we then reinvent our tools and methods to enable a greater cooperative working with local communities who might be suspicious of us initially? And how do we become facilitators of a process and not the drivers of it who wear an expert hat and come into these communities and offer ready solutions? So we again did this started this as a workshop with students, which we came up with the publication, etc. But the fundamental idea was to work with the community to not make the kind of formal drawings that we know, but identify through associative mapping landmarks which are important to the community, either through use or memory or association, and look at those sites which formally an architect or a planner might not consider very important, but the community values and considers very important. So we mapped those sites. But then what we realized that these sites were actually quite clean, quite livable, quite habitable by their standards. And the core of the settlement was actually something that the community took care of very well. But the problem lay in the places of neglect, which was the coastline itself. And while the same community was very careful about its own living areas in the core of the settlement, the same community was littering the coastline and was not respecting the community commons which it shared with other neighbors. And this became our sort of first point of intervention, because we realized that that's where we need to work to make this place livable for visitors to come in, for arts activities to happen, and for the city to really value this urban village not as a poor cousin or its backyard, but as something important. So we mapped the entire shoreline and the coastline, and we saw what all the problems are of solid waste management, of dump yards, of toilets that don't work, or even open defecation was a huge issue in this area. And all of these became enabled us to develop a project which was not building conservation related, but which looked at first creating a zero waste neighborhood, or at least inculcating the consciousness of my neighborhood, my responsibility in the citizens. And through these kind of caricatures and comic strips, we tried to bring about this awareness against, for example, open defecation, which was such a big problem in the area. And then we started using the children of the neighborhood, the children and our youth, as the people to reach out to their parents, because many times the parents are preconditioned, they are set in their ways, but the children go to school, and you can use them as an entry point to have these conversations with the families who live there. We found support also from the deputy mayor and the city agencies, who was a resident of the same neighborhood. And through using this idea of creating the children as waste warriors, we did a series of workshops with them on creating awareness posters, composting. So how do you really inculcate this notion of waste segregation and not littering the coastline, which each of these families were contributing to that. And using that as an entry point, we conducted these kind of cleanups along the coastline with the community that lived there, and then started talking to the community elders and the community seniors how we could convert the neighborhood into a zero waste neighborhood, start things like, say, maybe a composting pits and yards, have things like urban farming, with all of this which could be done by the community members and residents and women itself, and add to their economic livelihoods as well. And while simultaneously doing a thorough study of the requirements and talking to the city agencies in correcting the waste cycle that the neighborhood currently has. And so what were the flaws and the loopholes in that waste cycle, and how that could be corrected and amended. And also giving them suggestions to reuse and adapt, say, unused open spaces in the settlement into such composting pits, which the community could lead and run. And again, abandoned or unutilized parking spaces and open spaces to create more livable community parks and plazas, etc., which could be enjoyed not only by residents, but also by visitors coming here in time, because the coast and the sea was a great view that surrounded the entire neighborhood. So that's when I exited the project. But eventually, with this groundwork, we managed to find funding. The project managed to find funding through a corporate social responsibility initiative from a bank, and it has been carried through, or it is being carried through rather, in the subsequent years. So it did see some day. The final project that I'm quickly going to speak about is preservation as speculative action. And many times when we feel strongly about certain efforts, but the project doesn't really exist. So how do we go about it? And how do we create a project and begin to mobilize action, mobilize civil society, and mobilize support for a project that we think is very important, but actually it doesn't happen. So I'm going to come back to Calcutta, the city of my birth. And this is the other Calcutta. It's not the colonial Calcutta, it's the native quarters. The native quarters historically in colonial cities are looked upon with great prejudice and contempt. And as you can see, this quote I have put here, right from the British travelers to these places are looked upon as unsanitary, unhygienic, unscientifically planned, and all of this creates a negative impact and impression about these places long after the colonists have already left. So my engagement with this place actually started in an academic way when I was, so I've written books on them. My undergraduate thesis was on one of these quarters. I've done more of academic engagements, but nothing that really then converted to tangible action or change on ground. And after doing academic engagement for a year, I realized if it does not convert into tangible action on ground, and no matter how many research papers I wrote on the place, if this is what was going to happen to its buildings, it's really defeated. So the question was, how do you create an urban heritage project and awareness with no client and no funding? So again, I turned to community as a partner. Local nonprofits, the local residents of the area, educational institutions who I could approach and partner with that. And then with the community and nonprofit support, we did a first do-it-yourself workshop for heritage homeowners to sensitize them to basic restoration techniques, because many of them were trying to restore their houses but were completely using wrong methodologies and did not have which was detrimental to the integrity of their property. And we tried to have a workshop with them, introduce them to various kinds of ideas and theories and scientific material which can be accessible to them if they wish. And we did it in one of these houses. As you can see, it's a beautiful private residence in the courtyard of that house, and use the house as a laboratory to identify what are the sort of problem areas and pain points that typically historic homeowners face. And through this day-long workshop, sensitize them to the common issues, how regular repair and maintenance is very important to sustain these things. And that was followed up by a series of two participatory workshops, which thankfully we found some support, funding support from the tourism department to conduct a one-week workshop, which we wanted to map the streetscapes and the economic vitality and the architecture of the streetscape of this area. And that led to a sort of design charrette on what could we do as sort of guerrilla, almost like guerrilla urbanism, with small kind of money coming in. We could restructure shop fronts, have better lighting, urban furniture, facade reclamation, what could be done. So we came up with a series of small kind of solutions, but still not able to convert them on ground. But we offered this to the community, that if any of them wanted to pick it up and pool in their money and do some changes, these were ideas that they could pick up and utilize. And the good thing that happened is that, unlike my previous endeavors, which were all in art galleries and academic conferences, I was very sure that I wanted to take all my learnings and share it with the people and let them freely pick up whatever they wished. And also using that material to reach out to the larger city, having conversations on what do we do about inner city area, why are these not designated, why are they not protected. And through a series of traveling exhibitions and the feedback and the positive feedback that I received, I decided it was time to scale up. And last year, just before the pandemic, we did an international workshop with a school in Paris and 2 schools in India to do a month-long thorough documentation of neighborhoods along this old historic quarter, the street of Chitpur Road. And the students from these 3 places were here for a whole month, where we were trying to document and map the streetscapes, some specific neighborhoods, and the occupation and livelihoods together. So I'm not going to get into the details of it, but we kept trying to, whatever we did, whatever we documented and mapped, we tried to share it with the residents and with the city at large by holding exhibitions and feedback sessions with all of them. And the media support that we again received for this engagement with the students from Paris was very heartening. And of course, then the pandemic hit. So once everyone went back, when the students from Paris went back, we did a small exercise as a studio project to look at short-term, medium-term, and long-term responses post-pandemic as to how these places, which are commercial centers for production, and had been badly affected economically in the pandemic, how could they, through urban strategies and through architectural measures, work in a post-pandemic world. And that has led to an effort now which leads to identification of about 25 historic precincts along this entire neighborhood, which is now being kind of leveraged and lobbied with the city agencies for formal designation and protection. And at the national level, we have been able to take this up with organizations like ICOMOS, and build dialogue now with local bodies, with nonprofits, etc., and make presentations on the importance to designate. It's very important to designate, and now we've been able to create through pressure groups a pressure to change policy and prevent the city from delisting these buildings and these neighborhoods. And Calcutta does not have legislation to designate historic districts. It can only designate individual buildings. And so we hope that is now going to change. So again, my concluding slide is, of course, each of these four issues are something that every city, every part of the world, as a preservationist, we are aware of. But locally, there's so much that happens on the ground that no two places remain the same. And which is why my learning with working with communities is to empower them so that they can function as be our partners, rather than us being the experts guiding them, and function as agents of change, as informed stakeholders, as movement sustainers when we begin to either lose faith or hope or energy, and finally become the stewards and the torchbearers of their own heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamalika. This was great, very inspiring. I think if we all listen to what you said as like my neighborhood, my responsibility, I think we're gonna have a better world in the near future. Any questions from the audience?
I had a quick question.
Go ahead, please.
So hi, Kamalika, it's Ashima. Really nice to hear about all your projects. Congratulations. They seem really, really fabulous amalgamation of all your efforts. So I just had a quick question. In terms of sustainability of some of these efforts, have you found a way to kind of sustain them more long-term, just so that all of this amazing effort that you have, put in kind of stays for a longer period? Because I think that's one of the things that we struggle with the most, is over a long period of time, all of that amazing effort kind of goes down the drain. Yeah. And so I was wondering if you were able to find some ways to ensure that, just so that, it's sort of the project continues to bear fruit.
Right. So yes, that's a tricky situation, and as what I have discovered, because as you've seen with the places that I've worked with, all the 4 places, they're not popular places, and therefore one of the biggest efforts has been in first mobilizing the community itself. And therefore I would say that in the second project that I showed, which is using the lens of heritage tourism, that is something that might find longer term viability, because many more stakeholders are involved in the process. And whereas what the struggles that we have had with, say, the Chinatown project is that other than the local community, we have not been able to really get the interest of the city authorities or the network of stakeholders, because for many reasons. For example, political, they're such a small population, they don't have that much thrust on the political landscape. So then when a community has to constantly drive that change and sustain that change, there will be a finite limit to it. It will either the energies will flag or the resources will flag. So for any effort to be sustainable in the long term, there needs to be multiple stakeholders involved and engaged in making that happen in the long term. It can't just be the primary stakeholder of the community. If that answers.
Yes, great. Thank you. That's helpful.
Any other questions, comments? Rachel.
I'm sorry. Oh.
I think you're muted.
Yeah, Sherry, go ahead, please. Go.
I'm sorry. I was desperately looking for the button to raise my hand. Zoom's not a platform that I use too often. Thank you so much. This was really very, very interesting and a wonderful presentation. And I see a lot of parallels to the work that I have done in the past as a landscape architect in terms of trying to engage communities. I found your graphics incredibly engaging. And I think that's so important when you're reaching out to, dare I say, lay people, but people who aren't accustomed to looking at graphics as we are in terms of, mapping and drawing. So that three-dimensionality, I think, is fantastic. And I was really impressed with this idea of meeting people where they are, to go into their communities, to meet them right there on the ground, as opposed to having them come to, perhaps your office or community center that's far away, to really personalize the effect. So thank you very much. Really encouraging, something I hope to continue to apply in my work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Rachel?
So I also wanted to thank you. And again, this was so amazing. I really enjoyed your presentation. And I wanted to ask you about the first project that you presented on the Chinatown in Calcutta. I was wondering, have you published that here in the United States or in Europe, or are there any publications on that work apart from the publication that you showed us that was shared?
No, sadly, except that first tranche of initial funding from the university in Denmark, we haven't been able to secure any additional funding or interest to publish this to a wider audience. We've been looking for it, but it's not happened.
So if I might email you later, I have a thought of where you might share that work, a particular journal here that I think would be so interested in what you're doing there.
That would be great. Yes, thank you.
If I may interject, Rachel, so Kamalika, you forgot about her book.
Oh yeah, I mean, as an essay, yes. As essays, I've contributed recently a chapter in Ashima's book, and I've also written articles in different magazines and conference presentations. But I'm saying, I thought you're talking about republishing that book in as it was, as maybe as a second edition or to a new audience in America or Europe, because that book is not available anymore. We published 100 limited copies. So sorry, Ashima, I misunderstood. So I thought we're talking about the book per se, not
potentially thinking about the book, but also other venues in other academic journals here. But
yeah. So those I've done in the form of articles, essays, chapters, conference presentations. But I'm happy to reach newer audiences.
Thank you very much. I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Actually, Ashima is putting a link in the chat, link to the chapter that Kamalika wrote in the book. Thank you, Ashima.
Thanks, Mehar. I just want to say that the book also has a chapter by Michael and a chapter by the next speaker, and also a foreword by Jeff. So it's very much a Cornell HPP collaboration effort. So just wanted to do a little shameless plug. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Any other comments? Okay, great. Thank you, Kamalika. This was great.
Thanks so much.
Do we want a couple of minutes of break before the next presentation? I think it might be helpful if we start in 5 minutes. So let's take a 5 minutes break, and then we start at 11:10 Eastern time.